And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we saw his glory. These are some of the most provocative words in the whole Gospel of John, because what John says here in Greek, he uses a very particular word when he says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He literally says, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. He pitched his tent. And God isn't going camping today on Christmas, right? There's a very particular idea that John is picking out here. He makes a tent and we see his glory. When Moses and the Israelites were wandering in the desert, they pitched a tent. And it was called the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, but it was a temporary and movable temple. In the tabernacle tent dwelt the Ark of the Covenant, and Moses made the tent according to God's design as an image of heaven. And so the tent of meeting was this like portable temple that every morning or every day after they traveled, the Moses and the Israelites and the priests would pitch their tent in the desert. And then God's glory would overshadow the tent. It would dwell there as a pillar of cloud in the day and as a pillar of fire in the night. And when God's glory lifted up from the tent and moved forward, then the Israelites picked up the tent, picked up their own tents, and walked in the desert. So they literally followed God's glory as either fire or cloud throughout the desert. And every day when the glory settled, they pitched their tent. They made a very temporary temple. So St. John is saying something incredibly interesting to a Jewish audience. He says, the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us, and we saw his glory. When Mary in the Gospel of Luke is told at the Annunciation that she will bear Jesus Christ into the world, the angel tells her something very similar to this, right? He says, the power of the Most High will overshadow you. That Mary becomes the tent that God's glory overshadows, and she bears within herself the new Ark of the Covenant or the new presence of God in the world, Jesus Christ. In the book of Revelation, when John has this glorious vision of the heavenly city of Jerusalem in heaven, all the saints and angels are dwelling there, he goes to great lengths to describe the size of the city, its length and breadth and height and everything. And then he says one of the most shocking things that would ever occur to a Jewish audience. He says, in the heavenly city, there is no temple. There's no temple because God himself is that temple. This morning on Christmas, we celebrate God himself becoming our temple, God pitching his tent among us and dwelling permanently with the human race, even amidst this desert of our life as we wander, right? One day picking up our tent and wandering on to the next. God has dwelt among us. God himself has become our temple. And that's why they killed Jesus, right? Because Jesus claims that for himself. He says, destroy this temple, and on the third day I will rise again. Right? He's describing himself. He describes the temple of his body. Today, we celebrate that God builds a temple in his Son, Jesus Christ. We just heard yesterday on the fourth Sunday of Advent in our first reading, King David wants to build a temple for God. And God, through the prophet Nathan, says to King David, you want to build me a house, but I will build for you a house. I will build a temple for you. Today, he fulfills that promise. That today, God builds for King David and for all of his descendants here in the faith, he builds us a house. The city of Bethlehem in Hebrew means house of bread. So there's obviously some beautiful Eucharistic allusions there. Jesus Christ is born in a manger, right, which is where animals would eat. So Christ is born in a feeding receptacle in a house of bread. He's the living bread that comes down from heaven. You could go on forever. But the temple itself is also a house of bread. Because in the temple, right before God's presence, they would have showbread. They would always put bread right before God's presence as a part of their worship. That there would always be bread in the temple. The temple itself would have been a house of bread. And so Jesus Christ, the true and eternal and lasting temple, is built or born in a house of bread in Bethlehem. He's surrounded by animals, which brings to mind the ark, right? That Christ is here in a wooden structure surrounded by animals, just like Noah was in the ark. And the ark and the temple are the only two things in the Bible described in minute detail. We get the exact measurement of precisely those two things. We get to know how big the ark is, and we get to know how big the temple is. Because in the Jewish or in the biblical mindset, they're really kind of the same thing. That the ark is a prefigurement of the temple and vice versa. And here, Jesus, the eternal temple, is in an ark-like setting. He's surrounded by animals. And how do we understand the Magi, these wise men who come from far away and come to visit our Lord? Well, it all goes back to the story of the Queen of Sheba. So King Solomon, the son of David, finally builds the temple. He builds the house of God. And immediately upon building the temple and consecrating it and offering worship for the first time, the very next chapter of the Bible, the Queen of Sheba shows up. And she's a queen from far away, and she's heard of the great wisdom of Solomon. And she comes bearing gifts. She brings gold and spices. And she meets Solomon, and she hears of his great wisdom, and she gets to speak to him, and she marvels at the temple that he has built. At Christmas, we once again, like the Queen of Sheba, have people from far away coming to see the temple. That here at the manger scene is Jesus Christ, the temple. And the Magi bring, just like the Queen of Sheba, gold and spices so that they can worship here at this temple. They bring to a podunk town in Galilee all the items you would need for worship in a temple. We have it right here today. We have gold. We burned frankincense in the incense at the start of Mass. And myrrh is an herb that you would put in oil to anoint priests. So we have myrrh in those oils over there in the corner. We have gold, frankincense, and myrrh here in our church because gold, frankincense, and myrrh would have been objects that they would use to worship in the temple. The Magi are bringing objects for temple worship to the manger scene because Christ himself is the true temple. And just as that pillar of fire would lead the Israelite people through the desert by night, right? They could follow the pillar as it got up and moved. So the Magi follow the star, that during the night it moves, and it leads them precisely to where they need to go. That when the pillar of fire would stop, that was where the tent, the temple had to rest. So where the star stops is where the temple or the tent rests. It is God's presence with his people. Today at Christmas, we celebrate the birth of the true and eternal temple, Jesus Christ. And what that means is that we are never alone. Right? That part of the fall of Adam and Eve was that they were exiled from God's presence. They could no longer dwell in the temple of the Garden of Eden, and they had to leave their home. And we celebrate today a God who becomes a temple and pursues his people. That in the humanity of Jesus Christ is a sacred place that I can enter into, that I can draw close to, and that I can dwell with our Lord. And so this morning, in this house of bread, in this true temple, in this tent, in the midst of a dark and fallen world, in this ark, washed clean in the baptism of the flood, God builds himself a house so that he can draw us home. And let us just simply draw close to him this morning, right? That we can be with him, for he has dwelt here with his people.